So I'm going to go ahead and get started. How are you guys? Good? Good. Sorry, it took me a minute. We have a collie puppy. She's 4 months old, and she and my dog were under my feet and here in the office playing so loudly, y'all would not have been able to hear me. So it took concentrated effort of my husband and I both to get them out of here and into the other room. So sorry, if you hear them crying, it's just because they want to be in here with me for some reason. It caused me grief right now. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking to you guys about qualitative and quantitative data. I'm not going to go into great depth because that's really not the purpose of this course. But I'm also going to spend some time walking you through some data sets so that you can see what it looks like, how to analyze it, what you do with it, etc. But before I do that, just a quick reminder, as far as I can see, now, Moodle has been giving me some grief. I had done a bunch of grades last week, and I went in today, and they were all gone. And I get the feeling you guys hadn't seen them yet either, so I don't know what happened. But I went in and re-entered everything, and anything that had been submitted prior to 4:15 today, Central Standard Time, I have graded. So if you've got something that you've submitted that you don't have a grade on, just email me individually and let me know so I can go back in, because I have no faith right now that things were actually showing up for you guys on your end. And it was something to do with when your assignments were loading, and I would grade them, and then when I would put the grade in and enter your feedback, the process for me is I hit enter and it says okay, change is saved, notify student, I hit okay, and then your assignment would disappear, which it's not supposed to do. It's still supposed to be there. So I'm hoping the grades came to you guys. I can see them in my grade book, but again, if there's an issue, just let me know, and I'll go back in and reset and send that to you. And also too, I've got a couple people who have finished everything. The only thing that maybe they haven't done or I haven't graded yet would be there may be an outstanding forum, but I think I've even gotten to all those. And the work that I've been seeing on the final as well as the case study and stuff has been excellent. I mean, really, really exceptional work. So I'm feeling great about what you guys are doing and the results. And so hopefully everybody's going to finish strong. But I'm not seeing anybody with any real concerns as far as, filling class or anything like that. So thank you. You guys have been awesome. Before we start, and I cough, do you guys have any questions about the assignments? Okay, well, with that being said, let's talk about the kinds of data that you probably have been looking at and dealing with. We've talked about this a little bit before, that we know that there are two kinds of data, quantitative and qualitative. We also know that quantitative data is those things that are numerical and they can be counted or compared on a scale. So we use quantitative data in schools all the time. Attendance data, grades, state assessment data, passing rates, etc. Quantitative or items that we can count. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is something that is not necessarily counted, but includes things like narratives, logs, experiences. So if you do things like writer's workshop or reader's workshop in your classrooms, you probably have all kinds of anecdotal notes about students and their reading progress. That would be considered qualitative data. Now, there are some arguments about which is more effective and which is more helpful, but honestly, the way that you determine whether you need quantitative or qualitative data depends on what you're wanting to assess or learn. I wish in education that we would look at student achievement results on a more qualitative basis than always a quantitative basis, because as we know, some learning cannot be measured effectively using a paper and pencil test. I used to be the principal of the Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing and Visual Arts in Dallas. A very, very well-known, excellent institution. In fact, they have produced more scholars, presidential scholars in the arts than any other school in the country. But you know what? The sad thing was that the kids there spend 50% of their time practicing their arts and 50% of the time doing their academics. But the school was graded solely on academics. But you know, there is not a paper and pencil test to assess how well a student dances or how well they can, you know, perform in a production or design a costume or anything like that. We know that we were getting excellent results, and certainly we had some outside validation to show that. But the educational community as a whole is not set up to handle qualitative information and qualitative data. Another good example of qualitative data, if you've ever worked in or had a student maybe in a Montessori school program, Montessori schools do not give traditionally, now if they're a public school, sometimes they're forced, but traditionally they don't give a letter or a percentage grade like we're used to. They capture qualitatively where students are on a progression or a continuum. And oftentimes that is much more helpful than an arbitrary letter grade or an arbitrary even percentage grade. Because who's to say if an A in Miss Smith's class is going to be equivalent to the same level of rigor and expectation as an A in Miss Jones' class? It would be much more helpful to know qualitatively where students fall. You know, what is their reading level? Where do they struggle? Where are their successes? What do we see that, you know, they've accomplished in the last term? So again, qualitative data can have a very important role, but it also does, like quantitative data, have its limitations. Qualitative data is time-consuming, oftentimes difficult to collect, certainly difficult to quantify, and can present some challenges when it comes to comes to communicating that information. Quantitative data, like I said, can also have its limitations, and it doesn't always capture the true essence of what it is that we're trying to measure. Quantitative data can also be limiting in scope. And the other part of it too is, on a quantitative scale, unless we know everything is the same or equal, it can actually mean different things in different contexts or different situations. And again, kind of the most common example for us in education is, you know, if you get a 95 in one class, is that really equivalent to a 95 in another class? Sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. So the way that we look at particularly quantitative data, it is often helpful to us to know the mean, which I think we all know is the average, the median, which is what is the middle point or middle grade or middle score, and then what is the range. So knowing the scale is also very important. So for example, you know, when we do our discussion forums, the range of grades is from 0 to 10. The mean or the average for us is generally about a 9.5. And then the median score would, again, in this instance, be a 9.5, but it is that middle score. Quantitative data can be shown in frequency as well as percentage distributions. And like I said, we see this all the time. So for example, let's say that we're giving a multiple choice test with 4 answer choices, A, B, C, and D. The distribution of how students respond is basically going to be done by a percentage. So let's say that 25% chose A, 50% chose B, 10% chose C, and 15% chose D. That is a percentage distribution. Frequency distribution is the same thing, only it's by number. So let's say again we had 10 students who took the test. 3 of them chose A, 2 of them chose B, 4 of them chose C, and 1 of them chose D. Doesn't tell us anything about what was the correct answer, but it does tell us how students responded across a frequency distribution. You can graph that in a table. You can put it in a pie chart, a bar graph, whatever you want. And that information can be very helpful to us, particularly when we're looking at assessment data. So for example, if we know that on a state assessment or one of your classroom assessments in a multiple choice format, the correct answer is C, but only, making up a number here, only 10% of our students chose it, but 90% chose A. That tells us that there's something in that answer choice A that made the students choose that, and we really need to look at it more specifically to find out what was the element that pushed our students to choose A over the correct answer C. So frequency distributions can be very helpful to us in those sorts of instances. You can also look at other types of data. Like I said, you can use bar charts, you can use pie charts, etc. When you're looking at and trying to quantify or analyze quantitative data, there are multiple tools out there that you can use. I'm still a big fan of the good old paper and pencil. I know when I would go through and analyze data and look at and do comparisons, I got out my pencil and my eraser and my calculator and did that. A lot of people think that that's very antiquated, and it probably is. You can also do it through word processing, spreadsheets, or even custom databases. One of my very best friends actually is a data analyst for a very large school district, and it's not Dallas, by the way. But he does pivot tables all the time. And yes, they're super cool and they're wonderfully helpful and all that. I don't have a clue how you create a pivot table. So I go with what works best for me. But there are a lot of great tools out there that you can use for quantitative data entry. And some of you guys are probably way more proficient with those pivot tables than I am. Thinking about qualitative data, we generally use qualitative analysis to identify a theme, a pattern, or some sort of a segment of information. We can get this through a variety of ways. Psychologists, for example, they use qualitative data very frequently, and a lot of it's through interviews, through transcription, or case notes, clinical notes. Doctors rely on that very heavily. If you've ever taken an open-ended survey, where, it's not a true, false, or choose an answer or whatever, but, they ask you a question and you fill in the blank, that would be an open-ended survey. But you can also, and people don't often think about qualitative data coming from other media sources, such as a photograph or a video. So for example, if you're observing a student in a clinical setting and you videotape that and you go back and review it, that's qualitative data or information. If you work in a school where maybe they videotape you teaching and you and your principal will sit down and review that videotape together, then you're looking at qualitative data in most instances. It is important, particularly with qualitative data, that we can effectively communicate what we have found. Because qualitative data, unlike quantitative data, is very difficult to put into a readable or visual that really makes sense to people. It's easy to create a bar graph when you're using percentages or numbers. It's easy to create a pie graph when you're using those same elements from quantitative data. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is oftentimes very, very difficult, if not impossible, to put into those more traditional sort of charts and graphs. A lot of times, for example, I think they just opened up our course surveys to you guys, where you give us feedback about the course. And part of it is quantitative, but the comments at the end, the qualitative part, when I get those, I don't see your name or anything. I just literally get a listing of every comment. That's one way to communicate qualitative data. Now, I can quantify that data by looking for similar sorts of comments or by grouping them, et cetera, and come up with some ideas. But again, it's not going to be as simple as just creating a graph or other visual aid that we're used to seeing. It's also important, particularly when you're talking about qualitative data, to understand and know who your audience is. As teachers, it may be your students, it could be your parents, it could be other teachers in your building. If you're working in a leadership position, I know I was often called upon to present qualitative data and information to our school board. And so, it's important that you understand that audience. Qualitative data, you're going to get a lot of information that you may or may not need. A lot of it will be extraneous. So you really have to comb through qualitative data and pick and choose the pieces that are most helpful to communicate what it is that data is showing. And that is really, really essential as you're doing this. How do you report qualitative data? There's a million different ways, guys. Oh, sorry, my other video just finished. It may be through a written report. It can be, a data book. It could be a flyer. You could do a presentation. You could do a PowerPoint. You could create a website. There's a million different ways to go with it. But like I said, it's not going to generally include charts and graphs. Okay? So what do you want to do with this data? You first have to know what it is that you're trying to communicate from the data. So for example, some of you have pointed this out in doing the assignments. You know, not all data is helpful to you. There can be extraneous things. Like it may not be very important what the gender of students are. It's much more important that it's broken down by ethnicity or race or socioeconomic status. In other instances, gender is very, very important. So you have to make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're trying to communicate and what it is that you're looking for specifically in your data. The other part of it is, as well, is how are you going to use this to impact or change your program? Data is great and wonderful, but if all you do is look at it or analyze it and you don't use it to impact or to decide on program changes or elements, then it's just a bunch of numbers or just a bunch of anecdotal information, guys. It's very, very important that we do actually use that data to drive our instruction, to drive our program decision making, and most importantly, that we actually implement new and different actions based on the data. If we fail to do so, guys, we are missing a really, really critical part of data-wise and data planning. So that's your, elevator speech, I guess, on quantitative and qualitative data. What questions do you have before I move you into looking at some of these data sets? I know that was not the best instruction I've ever given in my life, but you guys are kind by not asking me hard questions. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We don't always do this so well. Hang on. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so what we are looking at, this is a data set from J.L. Long Middle School. This is a school that is in Dallas ISD. Obviously, you see the logo. Dallas has a very, very robust data system. And in fact, it is so robust that these reports can be anywhere from 50 to 100 pages. This one's 67 pages. So I just want you to imagine that you are a principal or a leader and you are coming back to school on August the 8th, which is when this report was done, and you were handed 67 pages of data. And you're given the task to analyze this, to use this to plan your school improvement plan, to get it into classroom instruction, and to actually act on all this data. So how in the world do you tackle 67 pages of data? Well, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so the first part is what they call, and like I said, they're going to vary, but this is just a nice sort of overview. So they do give you a table of contents, which shows data for students and staff. Texas uses the STAR test in English. The STAR L, which is for our for language students. STAR A is the alternative one for special needs. Shows you about English proficiency. Dallas has a common assessment system that they use across all the schools called the ACP, so that's the local assessment. And then, of course, you're going to see things that you would expect, such as enrollment, attendance, etc. So 67 pages worth of data that we get to go through. It talks about the summary, so you do have at least some idea about what the school is all about. This is generally written by the principal, and they excerpt it into the data packet that's developed from their research department. Enrollment, it talks about how they determine that, as well as attendance. So those are more like your definitions. Teachers, it talks about, again, where they pull their information from, as well as the various assessments. So tonight we're going to be talking about the STAR, which is the state assessment, TELPAS, which is the language proficiency testing that's done in Texas for all second language learners. And then finally, our assessment of course performance, which is the local, it's the district developed summative assessment that they use to assess curriculum. Okay, so your task and your job generally as a principal is going to be, you're going to be handed these wonderful data packets that people think are so helpful to you. And what you have to learn to do is pick and choose from the data what you need to act upon versus what is just kind of nice to know. So generally you're going to get information from your school district or your state that talks about enrollment. So, you know, if you're part of the school, some of this you're already going to know. So, but in this instance, this is a 678 school. They have 1,282 students, and you can see how it is broken down. And again, this is great quantitative data. It's broken down by ethnicity, and we are given the number of students as well as the percentages. And you have this for students as well as for teachers. So you will notice that we have 6.1% of our students are Black or African American, 15.3% of our teachers. Now, why would that matter? Well, there is a school of thought out there that we want our students to see teachers and other role models that are like them. So we can tell here at this school that certainly it's a somewhat equal, or so percentage. 67% of our students are Hispanic, but only 25.9% of our teachers are. So that would be something that you might want to consider looking at. Then it's broken down even further by the types of student groups that we have. So, at-risk students, in Texas, there are 13 indicators that determine if you're an at-risk student or not. That includes things like you failed a grade, you've maybe been pregnant in high school, etc. Economically disadvantaged are students who come from impoverished backgrounds. So those make up generally your Title I populations. Limited English proficient, these are students who come to school and their native language is not English. This school has a very high percentage of at-risk, economically disadvantaged, and limited English students. Special education. This is particularly important right now in Texas because they're in trouble with the feds for in fact, they're on a corrective action plan at the state level for over-identifying special education students. Typically, this number should be 10% or less. That's kind of the norm. This school's not as far out of whack as some schools are, but they are still sitting at 11.5% with 148 students. And then talented and gifted, they're sitting at 12.9% or 166. So this kind of background information just gives you sort of a quick snapshot of your school and what the demographics look like. Personally, I always shared this kind of information with my parents and my community as well as my teachers. We posted it on our website because a lot of times people do want to know what the school looks like, and this is just a very nice snapshot of good, easy to understand quantitative data. So you can see as well what's been happening with enrollment at this school. And it's a very large middle school, so you can see by grade level. You can see then again how it's broken down across multiple ethnicities, and then of course your totals. Now, interestingly enough, the school grew pretty significantly in one year, then leveled off just a little bit the next year. But again, this is a very large middle school. So, again, that can often be important. Probably not much else you want to do with this, but if I were a principal, I would be tracking, because notice, when my sixth graders, if my population of sixth graders has grown pretty significantly, from 397 to 2 years later, I'm sitting at 476. Remember, those sixth graders are going to become seventh graders, and then those same sixth graders will become eighth graders. So if you took that 476 and you move it to seventh and then on into eighth grade, and if you're continuing to bring in close to 500 sixth graders, within just 2 years, you're going to be sitting at 1,500 students. So this can be very, very important. And quite honestly, this was from 2016. I just checked their data today. In fact, they're sitting at 1,450 students in a building that was built for 1,000. So enrollment can be very important, even though it looks like somewhat innocuous sort of data. You do want to make sure you're watching for those things so you can be that proactive leader who is saying, wait a minute, guys, we're quickly approaching severe overcrowding. Being 50% above capacity. Okay, again, this is enrollment statistics. This time it's broken down by your various groups. Now in Texas, just like most states, your achievement results and your letter grade for your school is based on not only your cohorts of students or your totals, but also broken down. Particularly economically disadvantaged is a significant number, as well as your LEP and your special education. We also, I think it's interesting too, not a lot of people look at this, the new to the district rates. But you'll notice this school's bringing in a fairly significant number of new students. Why does that matter? This happens to be in a neighborhood that is completely developed. So I don't know how they're still bringing in all of these students when there is absolutely no new construction. So either families are choosing to have more children, or maybe as the population ages and new families are moving in. And honestly, what we began doing, looking across the community, and we worked in partnership with the city, what was really interesting was there was a lot of changes happening in the community. So typically we had a lot of smaller 2-bedroom kind of bungalow homes. People were coming in and buying them, tearing them down and building these huge mega mansion type homes and filling them with 3 and 4 children. So this is, again, a very significant number in this case. The other one is retention rate. I worked at a high school as a principal. We had a 40% turnover rate of students, which made our jobs particularly challenging. This school does not have a high mobility rate. They're retaining pretty well across the board. And I'm sorry, this particular retention rate has to do with kids being held back. So again, their numbers don't look too bad. They're pretty much in sync. Attendance, this matters greatly because these are dollars. Every time a kid comes to school, we get money. So if you're not sitting at a pretty high attendance rate, that's not good. So you'll notice that if you start comparing the average daily attendance for the school versus the district, now they're ahead of the district, but ideally you want these numbers to always be 97 to 98%. Because again, this literally means dollars. Then you'll notice continuous enrollment as well as stability. So are your kids coming to the school and remaining? And again, you're going to be looking, because we've talked about this before, you look horizontally as well as vertically at these numbers. So what's happening with my average daily membership percentage over time? Well, the good news is for this school, it's increasing. It increased by a whole percentage point. That may not seem like a lot, but trust me, it's a lot of dollars right there. The other one that you want to be looking at, not only are we growing in this area, but is there a difference between grade levels? Now, I know we're not surprised if you've worked with middle school kids. Our 6th graders are the most likely to come to school on a consistent basis, whereas our 8th graders are the least likely to do so. Sometimes you see that reversed. So, and interestingly enough, in 2015, 8th graders had a barely better percentage rate of attendance than our 6th graders. So what does that tell us? It may not tell us anything. It may tell us something specific. Okay, teachers. Again, this is data that I see often cited in the media about the lack of experience of teachers or lack of certification or whatever. So we've got our teachers broken down by race or ethnicity as well as by gender. We also look at their attendance and retention rates. So I'm concerned because in Texas you get 10 sick days a year and teachers are using 7.4. Now, it could be explained, maybe they had a flu epidemic, or it could be that these teachers are feeling extremely stressed and burned out and they're taking a lot of mental health days. Very critical information right here for a principal. The other one that's very critical is the retention rate. So the percentage of your teachers that are staying year after year. And notice, this is pretty low. I mean, can you imagine replacing 30% plus of your staff every single year? I mean, that's not good on any level and will make your lives miserable in the principalship. So I would definitely focus in on this number because that is concerning. Obviously, going along with that, you will notice that 43.5% of their teachers have less than 3 years of experience. Very, very inexperienced staff. 51.8 have only been there 1 to 5 years. So if you put those two numbers together, the majority of your teachers have been in the profession less than 5 years. You've only got, a really experienced staff sitting at less than about 25%. So, 3/4 of your staff is very, very, very young. Can't change it. It is what it is. But at the same time, this is certainly going to drive the kind of development that needs to be done, etc. So the data is telling us a story. We've talked about data storytelling. This is a very critical piece right here. Certainly going to inform the work that you do in the leadership role. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on these numbers because you guys are very familiar, I'm sure, with reading this kind of information. But again, we've got our number of students on the state assessment who performed at the satisfactory level. So like in Louisiana, this would be equivalent to basic, okay? And you can see that, you know, our white kids are doing great. Look at this, boy, all 90s plus. But look what happens to our African-American kids and our Hispanic kids, which is mirrored with our special ed and then our poor special, low SES, and then our special ed babies really, really drop off. And it's also really concerning what happened in special ed. We had 45.5%, and 2 years later, we're down to only 15.2% performing. Something very concerning here. And obviously, you're going to look horizontally at the gaps between ethnicities, which are significant, but you're also going to look year to year at what's happening across those. This just gives you the number tested, and that's compared to the district, so you get some sense of that. This is our students who failed the test or did not perform satisfactorily. And you'll notice the sad truth is the majority of our kids are in our most impacted, I guess, demographics. So this certainly has a big bearing on how well the school performs overall. And remember, it was a predominantly Hispanic population, so you would expect the number to be higher, but again, it's still something of concern. Now, these are the students who are scoring at the advanced or college-ready level. These are students in Louisiana that would be at your mastery or better. And again, there's a huge discrepancy between the number of Anglo kids or white kids who are performing versus our African-American, Hispanic, economically disadvantaged. And that trend continues across grade levels. To me, this is particularly disheartening. We did not have a single 7th grade African-American student who performed at math at advanced. I mean, that's heartbreaking. And you can see the numbers are incredibly low in this area. So lots of attention needs to be paid when we're talking about student achievement. This is where it gets very specific and starts talking about by particular objectives. So you can see how we're performing here. And, you know, the good news is, or bad news, depending on your perspective, we're pretty consistent in our results. The bad news is only 60+% of our students are doing well when it comes to literacy. And again, the same kinds of things. This has to do with writing. Then you'll notice the same thing, mastery, unsatisfactory, college and career ready, and again, African Americans, 0 on this one. Then again, you can see the percentage of students who are performing by particular objectives. And just keep in mind that composition and things like that, they're graded on a 1 to 5 scale. So that's why these scores look a little wonky here. Okay. Then moving along, this has to do with math. And again, it's reported very much the same way. Then it's broken down specifically by objective. And you will notice we are not doing very well on numerical relationships, particularly with our 6th graders. In fact, they're pretty flat and low across the board, but it becomes extremely concerning by the time they get to 7th grade because we're down to only 30% passing some of these. Now, while this is historical data, guys, I would definitely be creating my formative assessments that are heavily weighted in these areas. That's where my focus for instruction. I mean, of course, you have to teach, you know, what's in your curriculum, but I would make sure my formative assessments were doing what I call recycling, in that you are constantly, no matter what the content or the objective is for that particular lesson, my formative and summative assessments, as well as some of my instruction, are going to continue to include these really low areas so that we make sure our kids are seeing this over and over and over again, and it's being taught very effectively. Okay? This is our end of course or algebra results. Now, because this is a middle school, most kids take algebra in high school, so your best and brightest tend to take algebra in middle school, so they should do pretty well, which they do. Science, again, it's all absolutely reported the same exact way. So there is consistency in terms of the way that it's communicated across content areas. But let's move on into, this is our academic readiness or L scores. These are our kids who many times are brand new to the country. So Texas still thinks we need to test them, but you can see our results are pretty set. The numbers are very small though. It's a small percentage of students. So I'm going to kind of roll through those. And again, it's all reported the same way. Like I said, that's one thing that Dallas does very well. And if you were in the position of you just get all this raw data, this might be a nice organizational sort of tool that you could adapt later on into the future, because it does make sense, because it's consistent in the way that it's reported across grade levels, across content, etc. So teachers can be a little more comfortable when they're reading this. Let me see here, what else I want to show you. Okay, and again, these are just the various assessments. Okay, and sorry, it's probably making you dizzy, it is me. This is where they have aggregated information across multiple grade levels. So again, same idea, but this happens to be social studies and it's more aggregated data. But you'll notice that we're consistently doing the same thing. So we're looking at social studies and we start with satisfactory results, then we go to unsatisfactory, then we go to advanced, and then we look at by objective. And you will notice that we are not doing very well. You would think we'd do better than this in social studies, but these are very, very low scores across all objectives. So we really need to focus on that. This is our proficiency levels by language. So that's that piece. This also talks about the levels of language proficiency. So you have your beginning, intermediate, advanced, and advanced high students, and you can see how they're performing across subtests. And then finally, these are the ACPs, or the district-driven summative assessments. And they're broken down by semester. Dallas happens to be on a semester system, and they test everything, including foreign language, astronomy, etc. Pre-AP are the honors level courses. Those that are just like listed as mathematics 8, for example, is a normal, just a regular or on-level course. And you can see the number tested, percentage, the scale score. When they say course mark, that's the average grade for the course, and the percent that passed compared to the district. So for example, in band, which believe it or not, they give an assessment in band. In Dallas, 94.5% of the students at this school passed the test, whereas only 63.4% at the district. I will tell you, I know the band director, and she is exceptional, so I'm not surprised at her results. Okay, so that is your 67 pages of data. What you have to decide is what's important and what needs to be communicated. So the way that I would approach this is, I told you there's some areas that I would definitely look at to share with my faculty, and then we usually would literally take this and tear it apart. So we would look at aggregate data across grade levels and share that with the whole faculty, but all the science scores I gave to my science PLC. All my social studies scores went to my social studies PLC. And their job was to really make sense of that, and then to begin to plan instruction, whether it was enrichment, remediation, just good first instruction in the classroom based on this statistical information. Because you can imagine it's virtually impossible to walk through 67 pages of data with your faculty and keep them engaged and interested. It would take you about 3 hours to do it well, and I promise you that after 10 minutes, they're kind of going, oh my gosh, this is too much. So, like I said, break it apart. But I want you to be prepared as leaders. You know, we seem to think the more we give you in data, the better job we're going to do, and that's not necessarily true, guys. So you have to, part of the role, whether you're a teacher leading a PLC, or you're the principal of a school, or you're an assistant superintendent, because I got this for 14 schools, so I had about 1,000 pages worth of data that I had to come through and make sense of. So like I said, figure out ways to break it apart, to give it to the stakeholders that matter the most, and guide them through how to use it. You know, you're not generally going to be given raw data where you have to go in and figure out the percentages and the numbers and all that. Most data is going to be reported to us in a summary form. But like I said, 67 pages If this is a middle school with 67 pages, I guarantee you the high schools, because you also are going to have advanced placement or maybe international baccalaureate scores, SAT, ACT, graduation rate, and all that, their packets are well over 100 pages. So that is what I wanted to show you guys. Wasn't that fun? Whew. I've done that 10,000 times and I'm tired. So what questions do you guys have? Yeah, I know I just bored you out of your skulls, so that's probably why you don't have any questions. So when you go in to do your data plan, just a couple of questions I've been asked a couple times. So yes, there are going to be places you don't have the information, guys. That's not unusual. There are going to be things that maybe you want to know that you're not going to get out of your data. So what do you do in that case? Well, for the purposes of this assignment, you can just put no data available. But in reality, that may mean you need to find another assessment, or you need to go back and either dig a little bit deeper into the data that you've gotten, or if you have a district resource, go to them. Other times it may mean you need to create a formative assessment or even a summative assessment to get to that information. But like I said, we tend to give more data than is needed. That tends to be the way that we do this. But at the end of the day, data is only useful to us when it's things that measure what matters. Okay? And I can't emphasize that enough. Data is only important and useful when it measures the things that matter. I used to get very frustrated as a principal when they'd be calling me and saying, we need this information, we need this information, you know, and I'm like, for what? You know, it's not anything that's going to change achievement. Yeah, I was a difficult principal. They loved me sometimes because I would tell them, I'm not going to do it. I don't have time, and it's not going to help improve outcomes for my students. You know, and I would generally get the nasty response that you need to send it. And I'm like, you call my boss because I'm not doing it. Because honestly, don't spend your time in areas that don't matter. You know, I mean, things like how many tardies did you have? Well, who cares? You know, I mean, that let me deal with that at school. That's my issue from a discipline standpoint. But at the central office, I don't know why they need to know that. You know, I'm like, now ask me about how many students I have that need Tier 3 instruction in reading, or ask me about how many students who are reading 3 grade levels below in high school. You know, I'll give you that data. I can even narrow it down and give you the students' names and the objectives and where they're missing foundational pieces. You want the data that matters? I can give it to you. But I'm not going to spend my time expecting my staff or my teachers to gather extraneous, unnecessary information. And, you know, I'm not saying don't be, you know, to be, obstinate comes to mind. There's other choice words that aren't quite as nice, but, you know, I'm not asking you to be insubordinate. But, you know, thankfully I worked for people that really respected what we were trying to do, and they would run interference. And I know I did that as an assistant superintendent. When my principals would get these ridiculous requests, they'd send them to me, and I'd call somebody and say, I'm sorry, my schools aren't going to do this. You know, and most of the time, particularly in a large system, you know, these people don't have direct line supervisory responsibilities anyway. They just are doing, you know, they want this for some other reason. So like I said, really focus on the data that's important and it's going to improve outcomes for your kids. Yeah,
I feel like I should say amen right now.
Amen. Yeah. Like that, you know, I worked in large school districts, small school districts. I worked in a private system for a little while, and you know, it was amazing to me that the same kind of stuff came up in all systems. You know, particularly in a district like Dallas, my gosh, we had a staff of 40 people that worked in research and evaluation. I'm like, you guys have staff to do that. I don't. You're asking me to pull a teacher or a counselor or an administrator, and we should be working with teachers and kids to give you data that you can go find on your own. So, yeah, don't be afraid to stand up for your schools and use the data that's helpful. What other comments or questions do you guys have? And I'll get off my soapbox tonight.
We always have openings in Ascension Parish. We'd be more than happy to we'll welcome you with open arms.
Well, thank you. If I get tired of what I'm doing, I may. There are times I really miss the schools. Well, like I said, everything you guys have been doing a great job with the assignments. I wish, it's really, really hard in an online 7-week class to really get in and dig in the data and play with it, because the most effective ways to do that, and I'm a huge proponent of online learning, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you just got to sit there with somebody, like I said, with colored highlighters and sticky notes and pencils and those pieces to dig into it. But, at the end of the day, data can be very intimidating. And when we start talking about and analyzing it and all that, we all think that we've got to do, I don't know, these crazy research methods and all of those kind of things. For everyday school-driven purposes, all you need to be able to do is add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And be able to look across grades, across years, and across content. And like I said, you're going to be looking, horizontally. How do our white students compare to our Hispanic students? How would all of our students compare to the district or the state? Then you're going to look horizontally. Are we improving over time? Or are we seeing this sort of up and down, which was, in the data sample I just showed you, that happens a lot in Long. At Long Middle School, they're doing okay, and then they get a bump, but then the next year they're right back down. So, you want to be able to identify those pieces. And then specifically, you're going to want to look by objective, by kid. And that's the kind of data where you need your teachers in there involved. I can do that all day. I know how. I can do it pretty efficiently, and then I can hand it to somebody. But until they get their hands dirty and really dig in and start looking, that's not very effective for me to do it and hand it to them. So that's why I said I tore apart those data packets, and I'm like, okay, here's your summaries. Now, let's pull out those individual student reports by objective. Now let's start digging in there and identifying what are the trends that we're seeing with our students. Which of our students are really at the very bottom? Which ones are in the middle or on that bubble? And which one of our kids are doing great? Because remember, we're not only supposed to teach, if you think about that RTI model, and I've done this before, so excuse my hand signals, but, typically the RTI model looks like this, right? Where you've got your level 1, 2, 3. Well, I actually see it this way in my head. I invert it. Because that top tier of your good first instruction, that should mean that 90 to 95% of your kids, if you do a great job with first instruction, 90 to 95% of your kids get. Of that 90 to 95%, though, you're going to have 5 to 10% that need tier 2 interventions. Now, we think, we get all worked up, or at least my teachers did, about, oh my God, interventions, RTI, yeah. When in reality, if we do a good job in tier 1, that's a pretty small number. If you think on a class-by-class basis, 10%, it could be as few as 2 to 5 students, depending on your class size. But tier 2 instruction is that reteach piece. And that can be done pretty easily in most classrooms during class time. Whether you regroup your kids, you do collaborative learning, you pull in, the old model where the teacher's sitting, at the U-shaped table with the kids right there in front of them. That's one way to do it. You can do it through peer teaching, etc. That's going to handle this for most of your kids. Tier 3 is the piece of those students, or the part, of those students who don't get it after we do tier 2 interventions. You cannot give a formative assessment, or you shouldn't, and decide, here's my tier 1, here's my tier 2, here's my tier 3. Because in the way the model is intended is, most of them get it the first time. Those that don't, they're going to get it the second time. Then there's still going to be a couple, 1, 2, 3, whatever, but basically 1 to 3% that need tier 3 instruction. Your tier 3 kids, based on your data, are the ones you pull out for after-school tutoring or Saturday school or whatever. But where data becomes so critical is when you're doing that tier 3 instruction, it's not more of the same. I'm not going to give you this whole lesson again on how you summarize or how you draw a conclusion or how you do 3-digit multiplication. Instead, I'm going to drill down and look at you on a very prescriptive basis and identify either gaps, foundational issues, maybe concepts that you missed that we need to be able to be successful, and you get very specific. So it's the idea of triaging. Then you customize that tier 3 intervention to address those specific learning issues. Far too often, we do tier 1, then we turn around and do the same thing in tier 2, and then we do the same thing in tier 3, and we wonder why they didn't get it. Well, I'm never going to master, for example, how to multiply using decimals if I don't even understand the concept of multiplication in the first place. But instead, I'm just going to keep teaching you how to multiply with decimals, and I just get frustrated when you don't get it. Even after you do tier 3, there may still be some students who still don't get it. That's an appropriate time for maybe a special education referral or for some other kind of intensive intervention. But again, that shouldn't be more than one, maybe not even one student at that point. Also, don't forget that while we're addressing our, I'll do this again, whatever, like this. When we're doing our model, I put another layer on the top, which is our enrichment. Because we oftentimes forget about those kids who are at grade level. And so we teach everybody right here at grade level. And then we've got this group of students who really, they already knew everything at grade level when we taught it. And we don't do anything else to push their learning or expand upon their knowledge. One of the things that I found when I first went to Booker T. Washington was they had pretty good overall results. I mean, you know, they were a recognized school. Roughly 80% of the kids were, you know, mastering and stuff. But when I really started looking at the data, what I found was kids would come in the school in 9th grade, and they would be at the 11th grade, maybe level in reading. By the time, so theoretically, right, you're in school 1 year, and you're at the 11th grade level in 9th grade, so by the next year, you should be 12th grade. Then the next year, you should be, you know, freshman college, and the next year, sophomore college level. We were doing a great job, but by the time everybody graduated, they were all at the senior level, 12th grade level, because we had dumbed down everybody to average. And we pulled up our low kids, but we had also pulled down our enrichment kids. So don't forget as well that while we're talking about intervention, we also have to provide and make sure that we are keeping our most gifted and our most academically talented students moving forward at least 1 year of progression, regardless of whether or not they're at grade level. Because I think that's a really critical piece. But data is what helps us to know that. And it has to become individualized, particularly at tier 2, tier 3, and at enrichment level. Because if you don't use your data to decide who those kids are and what their needs are, you're going to bring, in an ideal world, you bring everybody to average. But in reality, what happens is you bring your bright kids down to average, you lose some of your kids that were on grade level down to tier 2 and tier 3, and that's where they stay. So data is really the only way out.
We had issues. We have issues with that at our school because we have a very large population that is either slightly below level or very below level. And so we have worked very hard over the past few years to bump those kids up. And we know the strategies to help the low kids. We know how to deconstruct standards and make sure to get them at the very base of where they need to be. However, we have forgotten about our basic and mastery kids.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're falling short is, okay, so what are you doing for those kids who are on level? And, you know, so our score is indicative of that, you know, that we're not doing anything to enrich those higher kids. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, that's very common because we've all been trained to focus on our kids who need help. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, we noticed at Booker T. Washington was our ACT scores were below the state average and also below what, you know, is the expected standard for college entrance, basically. And so we decided that instead of focusing on remediation, we took that word completely out of our vocabulary and all we did was enrichment for everybody. And so we took our on-level and slightly above-level students and we set goals for them and we made those the same goals for our kids who were 2 and 3 years below. And I even had some students who were, you know, reading 3 and 4 years below grade level. And the goals were the same for everybody. Now, the treatment was different. Because we looked at where they were starting and where they needed to go, as well as to sustain. And honestly, within less than 3 years, our ACT scores grew by almost 6 points, which if you're familiar with ACT scales, that's very significant. And we were extremely proud of the fact that we actually had the highest ACT scores overall in the entire school district. And we even beat out the talented and gifted magnet, where you couldn't get in unless you scored at the 99th percentile or better. But I really think it had a lot to do with the mindset of no more remediation. Everybody just needs to be enriched. And that really high expectations made a difference for the kids. Okay. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, I think I've graded pretty much everything. And if if something's missing, which is entirely possible because Moodle hates me, just please email me and let me know. I put in a ton of grades last week, and I was very disheartened when I noticed that they had disappeared. So there's something weird going on, because like even today, I would go back and re-enter your grade, enter your feedback, and I click save, and then notify students, okay. And what's supposed to happen is it just tells me okay, and then I can exit out of your screen and go to the next student. Today, for some reason, everything disappeared, so I don't know if the grades are there or not. They look like they are, but if you feel like if you've turned in something and you don't see a grade in Moodle, just email me, please, to make sure, and I know too, as a system, we've been having some Moodle issues today. We kept losing some stuff, so. But the work looks excellent. You guys have done a great job, and a couple of you, like I said, are completely done. So thank you for still coming to Zoom tonight. All right, guys. Y'all have a great night, and we will see you next week, our last meeting.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.